Olá, damos início aqui à transmissão dessa conferência que está organizada.
Now we begin with the transmission of this conference that's being organized by USP of Advanced Studies. And I invite today Professor Axel Bruns. I will introduce it in English. We are conveying it in Portuguese also. We have a link specifically for that if you want to use the interpretation. Another link for the English transmission. I'll start speaking English now. And the audience can choose by going to the link that we have provided. It will be on a YouTube channel. We have a chat there. By means of the chat, you can ask questions, and Professor Bruns will present his slides in 45 minutes, and we'll have a few minutes for Q&A.
Professor Axel, for finding a time to meet us here and to talk to us. Unfortunately, we couldn't make it that you come presentially to Brazil, to São Paulo, to make this presentation, but it's very good to have an opportunity to hear you. In Brazil, as you probably know, just like in Australia and elsewhere, the ideas that filter bubbles and echo chambers have dominated the studies about the interface between social media and internet and politics for maybe the past 10 years. It's been a hypothesis that it's everywhere. Every studies are working with this. And even though in the past years we have difficulty finding empirical grounds to support this thesis, it's still very present. So yesterday we had a panel at the University of São Paulo where Brazilian researchers were discussing how their research find or do not find elements to ground this hypothesis that is so disseminated. And we're very eager to hear you about this. So if people do not yet know Professor Axel Bruns, he is one of the leading voices asking for that we look more critically to the idea of filter bubbles and echo chambers. Professor Axel Bruns is an Australian laureate fellow and professor in the Digital Media Research Centre at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. He is the chief investigator in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society. He has written several books, but the one that concerns us here is Are Filter Bubbles Real? Professor Bruns, thank you for being here with us today, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be able to talk to you at least this way. I'm really sorry as well that I couldn't make it to Brazil at this point. Although I'm very likely to be there next year because, as you may know, the Association of Internet Researchers Conference is coming to Rio in October next year. So hopefully I'll be able to visit Brazil again at that point. And I do work with quite a few Brazilian scholars as well. So I know that there's a lot of really exciting internet research going on in Brazil as well. So it's always wonderful to talk to the Brazilian community as well. I'm going to just share my screen here and start my slides. Hopefully that's coming through and you can see it. So yes, I'll talk about this question of filter bubbles and echo chambers because the two are often very much used interchangeably. Just before I get started, what we always do here in Australia is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we live and work. In my case, that's the Turrbal and Yagara people of Mianja in Brisbane. As the First Nations owners of the lands where my university now stands, pay my respects to their elders' laws, customs and creation spirits, and recognize that these unceded lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. And I want to acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within our community. So as you said, and this is not meant to be an advertisement, but just to point this out. So this is very much a talk based on this book, Are Filter Bubbles Real? And, I've published quite a few other things about this in the past as well. And I was kind of motivated to write this book because, as you're saying, there is so much use of these terms, echo chambers, filter bubbles, without necessarily using them particularly well or in a particularly systematic kind of way. So I want to start by going through this a little bit and then see if we can provide some evidence for whether they exist or perhaps for the reasons that they cannot exist. So starting with the concerns, and it's always interesting to see where these terms, echo chambers, filter bubbles, and derivations of those terms end up. And this kind of really threw me in some ways, that even in the farewell speech of Barack Obama, we saw a reference to bubbles, and really what he means, I think, is filter bubbles, where he says that for too many of us, it's become safer to retreat into our own bubbles, in our neighborhoods, our college campuses, places of worship, or he says especially our social media feeds, surrounded by people who look like us and share the same political outlook, and never challenge our assumptions. So that's a very direct reference to filter bubbles, I think, particularly in social media. He might have just as well have said echo chambers, but either way, it shows how much currency these terms have, how widespread they are really across all of society, all the way through to the speeches of US presidents. And, particularly in the US, and I'm sorry, I guess I could say something very similar about Brazil as well, given the events of the past few years. Particularly in the US, of course, we've seen what looks like evidence for filter bubbles. We've seen, and sorry, there probably should be a trigger warning here, events like this, the coup attempt at the US Capitol of largely very much a QAnon-informed group of Trump supporters who stormed the Capitol and tried to take over essentially the running of government, the certification of the election results. So we see this, and many people have then said, well, this is evidence of filter bubbles. These people clearly live in a different reality. And it's not just these people who are actively trying to overthrow the government, but some years ago, this is more than a year after the 2020 US election. Clearly 53% of Republicans were still living in a kind of an alternate reality where Donald Trump had actually been elected. Lots of people are then saying, well, this is evidence that these people are in filter bubbles and echo chambers, that they're kind of detached from reality and have a very different view of the world, and that must be because they are in filter bubbles or echo chambers. Now, looking back a little bit further, going back a bit further into the history of this question of echo chambers or filter bubbles is instructive though as well. And we find that a lot of it early on has to do with the question of personalization. And it's interesting that the meaning really of personalization has kind of changed over the years. Back in the mid-90s, when the Web 2 really first arrived and we first started talking about personalization, we had scholars like Nicholas Negroponte writing about the daily me, the idea of a daily newspaper that would be customized to your particular interests. So if you're not interested in sport, then sport wouldn't be in there. If you're not interested in politics, then politics wouldn't be in there, and so on. So every customer, every user of a news website could get their own personalized experience and never have to see the things that they're not interested in. At the time, that was seen as a good thing. Which might surprise us now, because so much of this idea that people are in these different information cocoons, if you want, is now being seen as negative. But at the time, that was seen as a good thing, because you wouldn't get the boring stuff anymore. You'd only get the interesting parts of the news. So that was at that point very much a positive development associated with Web 2. But fairly soon thereafter, we saw scholars like Sunstein write about echo chambers, and he's continued to write about echo chambers over and over and over again in various versions, and has updated this to the information environment that has evolved, so beyond search engines to social media platforms and so on. And then a little bit later, Eli Pariser wrote about this idea of filter bubbles in 2011. So these last two particularly have been very much responsible for building up this idea of echo chambers and filter bubbles, and have very much taken a negative view on those developments, on this idea of personalization. So we've gone from good to bad personalization, if you like. And the problem is that these terms are very often used very much interchangeably. That on the side there, by the way, is Eli Pariser, who introduced the idea of the filter bubble. The problem is that really both Sunstein and Pariser don't ever really quite bother to explain what they mean exactly by echo chambers and filter bubbles. It's clear that they mean it's a bad thing, but they're not really saying, how do they come about? Where would we find them? Pariser starts out literally in his book saying, okay, I asked two friends to Google something. They got different results for their Google searches. So obviously they're living in different filter bubbles that are determined by the search engines. And that's quite flimsy as an anecdote to build an entire theory on, of course. So the question was, and this has evolved over time, what causes these things? At first, with Pariser, with filter bubbles, as I say, it was general search engines. This has also evolved to take in other more specialized search engines and portals and recommender systems and so on. And then, of course, more generally now, over the last few years, we've talked about social media as a source or as a location of echo chambers and filter bubbles. And there too, of course, it's not enough to say social media put us all in echo chambers, because different social media platforms have very different affordances, very different communication tools. So are we in echo chambers around our profiles, around the pages and groups that we might be visiting, for instance, on Facebook, hashtags on Twitter, X? So where would we exactly find them? And that's not really been exactly explained. Really, what exactly do we mean by this? Do people have to be absolutely locked in and disconnected from the rest of the world in order to be in an echo chamber or a filter bubble? Is it enough to just be in a group of partisans, of hyper-partisans perhaps, like QAnon, that are kind of, throwing out anyone who doesn't belong, who's got alternative views, and build up their own ideology? Or is it really even just any kind of partisan community, any community of interest ultimately? Are they already echo chambers and filter bubbles? And if that, then really any political party would be an echo chamber or a filter bubble as well. And I think that gets problematic, because then we really just mean communities. And we have a term, we have the word community. We don't need others to talk about the same things then. And the mechanisms for their emergence as well are not necessarily entirely clear either. One aspect may be, of course, that society overall is simply polarized and maybe increasingly polarized. So it might be an ideological or another form of societal and social segregation between different groups of citizens. Of course, algorithms get blamed a lot as well in all of this. So it might be the algorithms that put us all into these different publics, and so these publics no longer communicate with each other. Or maybe there's a feedback loop between the two. Again, this is not necessarily always entirely clear in the writing. And again, that's really one of the big problems, that so often, particularly with Pariser, with Sunstein as well, there's this sort of argument from single anecdotes. Okay, Pariser asked two people, they got different results, so they're in filter bubbles. Or this idea of common sense, and that's really coming through in the Obama quote as well, that's just everybody knows we're in filter bubbles. And that's not enough for us as scholars, obviously. We need actual empirical evidence. And frankly, the people who have been promoting this, especially strongly, Cass Sunstein is a legal scholar, Eli Pariser calls himself an activist and tech entrepreneur, they're not communication scholars. And that, I think, is a problem as well. So we, as communication scholars, need to really find whatever evidence there is for the existence or lack of existence of these things. So the definition is very uncertain. This is particularly problematic also because, of course, these terms are used very widely in mainstream discourse as well, often actually interchangeably. And in fact, you can find plenty of scholarly articles as well that just say echo chambers, also known as filter bubbles, and just throw the two terms together as if they're the same thing. So I think we're all of us not really clear enough in the language that we're using as we talk about these things, as we're trying to find evidence to these. But what I think is fundamentally clear is that they're very much related to the underlying network structures within which we operate, the ways in which we get information, the ways in which we engage with others. And so In the book, I've been trying to kind of tease these things apart and offer two definitions for echo chambers on the one hand, filter bubbles on the other, where echo chambers would be based on connectivity. So whether or not people are connecting with each other only within their own ideological enclaves or more broadly. And filter bubbles are based on communication. So whether people are, independent of who they're connecting with, actually communicating across boundaries or not. And this is just a really dodgy way of showing this. So in echo chambers, lots of people kind of enclosed in a space where everyone who's in that space has the same sort of views, ideas, values, beliefs, ideologies, and so on. And filter bubbles where communication happens only within networks of like-minded people. So there's a subtle difference, in the book I go through this in some more detail, but these are sort of the kind of the key definitions. And I'm sorry, there's quite a bit of text on this slide, but essentially when an echo chamber comes into being, when there's a group of participants that choose to preferentially connect with each other to the exclusion of outsiders, and the more they do this, the more connections are created just within the group, and the more they're disconnecting from people outside of the group, the more isolated, of course, from the introduction of outside views and outside people the group is, while the views of the members are able to circulate very widely within that group. Whereas a filter bubble, then in my definition, would emerge when a group of participants, independent of who they're connecting with and how they're connected with others, choose only to communicate with each other to the exclusion of outsiders. So the more consistently they do that, even if they've got plenty of other connections, the more they're just communicating with people who've got the same views as themselves, the more those views will circulate amongst those members and information from the outside can't get in anymore. So that's a subtle definition. We can argue about this, but just to find a way to actually tease these two concepts apart, I think it was important to try and define them more clearly. And of course, both of these could be still driven, so that's very much still left open. They could be driven by algorithmic curation and shaping, or they could be driven by personal choice, or possibly by both of those. But what's the evidence for any of these to exist? So let's actually, I'll go back quite a bit here, 20 years almost back now, to a study of the US election in 2004. And this is really one of the first major appearances of this idea of the echo chamber, where Lada Adamek and Natalie Glantz studied the network of blogs, of Democrat and Republican blogs following the US election in 2004. And had this graph and said, well, this shows mild echo chambers because Democrats connect more amongst themselves, Republicans connect more amongst themselves. You can see very clearly, though, there is also quite a strong interconnection still between the two of them. So they come to this conclusion that this shows mild echo chambers, which to me doesn't really make sense because the whole point of an echo chamber is that you are disconnected from the outside world, that you're disconnected from people who have other views than yourself. So if these clearly are still connected, and if there's a mild echo chamber, then what does that even mean? It cannot have, quite logically, the really negative consequences that people talk about when they talk about echo chambers, because clearly there is still a lot of interconnection between the two sides. There is polarization, yes, but there isn't at this point the kind of disconnection from the other side where you just don't know what the other side thinks anymore and you no longer have any kind of contact with them. So this is ultimately quite confusing. More recently, of course, we've moved on to more modern platforms, Twitter as it was, less so on Facebook, although there's some work on that as well. Working on Twitter, particularly with hashtags or keyword data sets. And there's a study like this, for instance, which looked at climate change debates on Twitter, and found confusingly both what they called open forums and echo chambers, and in fact said that people were in both of them at the same time, which again kind of goes against the idea that echo chambers or filter bubbles disconnect you from the rest of the world. So they looked at a number of different hashtags, which you see at the bottom there. They looked at follower, retweet, and mention networks and found that, yes, in follower networks, there's quite a bit of separation there. So that's what I would call echo chambers, or at least the tendency to form echo chambers. In retweet networks as well, there is quite a bit of separation there. You only retweet your side of the climate change debate, not the other side. But in mentioned networks, there's a really strong cross connection between both sides. So if that's the case, though, then people are still fully aware of what the other side's thinking. They're fully aware that the other side exists and who the people are on the other side, which again makes it very difficult to say that these are echo chambers or filter bubbles, in the sense that they're just disconnecting us, and we've retreated, as Obama says, into our own bubbles where we no longer see what the other side's thinking. So there isn't really a great deal of evidence that shows that people are fundamentally creating these totally sealed off information cocoons for themselves. Rather, and these are just some sample studies, of course, rather we're seeing that there's still a lot of cross connection between the different sides of a debate. We find this through other work as well. The Pew Center, and sorry, I've got quite a few US examples here, but this is from the 2016 US election, where they actually said, well, lots of people would like to be in filter bubbles, frankly, because they're just sick of hearing about Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton at that point. So they're really actively trying to disconnect from people who have opposite views, but they find it very, very difficult to do so. And they're really exhausted by the attempt to just get rid of all the Trump fans or the Hillary fans in their network. While people might want to create echo chambers and filter bubbles, they're finding it in practice very, very difficult to do so. And that's got something to do with the structure of those social networks, those platforms, and in fact, the fact that we're not using them for politics alone, but for many other things. This is a German study that kind of showed something very similar, where they looked at the pages, they looked at followers of political party pages, and then looked at what other pages these people were following. And they found that by and large, people from almost all areas of politics in Germany still had very much shared interest. They still cared about football, of course. They cared about entertainment. They cared about, funny stuff, whatever it might be. And so they still very much came together around those shared interests. And, politics was only a small part of what they did there, except for the followers of the far right, the AfD, the neo-Nazi party in Germany. They were really a group by themselves, and their other Facebook interests also circulated around things like anti-immigration and so on. So they, if anything, were perhaps most likely to be in, again, some sort of mild echo chamber, if you want to call it that. And we here in Australia did some work also looking at the overall structure of follower networks in the Australian Twitter sphere, and there too found that there were actually very few isolated groups in that network. We found that overall the map was very strongly connected. Even that cluster of kind of the hard right in Australian politics was still quite strongly connected with the rest of the political debate. So there's just no strong evidence, and you can look further and further for really these sort of hermetically sealed echo chambers, filter bubbles that are disconnected from everything else. That, by the way, is true if we go back to where the filter bubble idea started in search as well. There's now plenty of studies that have come out that show that search engines, whether that's Google Search or Google News, basically keep recommending the same small set of pretty mainstream news sources over and over again. This is a study from 2019 where you see New York Times, CNN, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, CNBC, Business Insider, and they already account for the vast majority of results. So search too really tends to point to a small set of major outlets. They're recommended to people, whether they are defining themselves as conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, whatever. And in fact, this particular study says that there's almost too much uniformity in the search results. It would be nice to have more diversity in what's being recommended, not less. So in many ways, this shows that if there is a filter bubble at all through search, then the entire nation is in that filter bubble. And that in itself is, of course, not a problem, because, the very point that filter bubbles are arguing against is that people are in these information cocoons. So if the entire country gets the same information, that's not the problem that the filter bubble hypothesis raises. The same's been happening in Germany. There's been other studies as well. In Germany, for instance, and the visualization here is not so important, but essentially what they showed was that for a large number of people who were involved in this trial, they got the same search results for the same searches, and often even in the same order of results. So again, this kind of shows that there just aren't any filter bubbles in in search. We did something very similar in Australia again with the Australian Search Experience project, and we found that even, and this is maybe a bit of a busy graph, but essentially these are the results from the first result on down. We found that particularly for a controversial search, obviously a controversial topic perhaps at the time, like Black Lives Matter, we found that the first 5 results were very, very stable over the period that we looked at it. Not only are search results the same for everyone pretty much, but they are also incredibly stable in what's being returned over and over and over again. So, again, this shows that there aren't any filter bubbles in search, basically. So if we're not finding real evidence for echo chambers or filter bubbles in empirical work, why might that be? Now, one of them might be that people are kind of looking in the wrong places. Yes, there are some studies that say within this hashtag there is polarization, or there are these 2 different groups that don't talk to each other, or the hashtag itself is just purely full of one ideology versus another. But of course, they don't exist in a vacuum. Even on Twitter and certainly on other platforms as well. Just because one particular space has a single-minded ideological community, they're still in a very complex platform structure, and there's still they still have participants that do many other things on these platforms as well. Because pretty much all of us are sharing news content or news-like content very frequently in our social media engagements. We keep seeing a lot of stuff circulate that comes from all kinds of sources, from all kinds of political backgrounds. And while we might gravitate ourselves to things that are of interest to us, that maybe confirm our own political interests or biases, and that is selective exposure. So we might select what we actively expose ourselves to. It doesn't mean that we're actively avoiding anything, evading anything that goes in a different direction. Most people simply haven't got the time to constantly unfollow and disconnect and downrank and whatever content that they might not be so interested in. They'll just ignore it. But even in ignoring it, they're still seeing it. Similarly, we might, yes, of course, drift towards others who've got similar interests to us. So that's homophily. But we're often not really, again, investing the time and energy to disconnect from others who have maybe slightly or more widely different interests. So what in the literature are often called often called echo chambers may just be communities of interest that are just slightly better connected amongst themselves than they are connected with the rest of the network. So I think we've got to be very careful here not to just see every sign of clustering, of community building as an echo chamber or a filter bubble. For that, people would really have to disconnect from the rest of the network to really make that information cocoon complete. And that's really, really difficult. Again, I need to stress this point because while we might see, yes, for instance, on Facebook pages and other kind of mechanisms for bringing people together around a shared topic, they may well be engines of homophily, of connecting with others who've got similar interests. In many other spaces, even on the same network, let's just take Facebook as an example here, we see context collapse. And that's, of course, a concept that's been around for some time. So around our profiles, for instance, we connect with people who, yes, maybe have similar political interests, but we also connect with friends and family and co-workers and people we went to school with and people who share the same interests in the same football teams or whatever else it might be. So there we're connecting a lot with others who've got very different interests from us and who may not politically align with us. So for the most part, social networks actually are engines of context collapse where we encounter many others with many different kinds of views, not just people who have the same political interests as we do. And of course, that's particularly the case also because most of us, and I'll exclude there people like Sunstein and Pariser and probably political journalists and maybe many of us as media and communication scholars and maybe people who research politics and have political interests. But most people actually do not only connect with our, as Pariser calls it, political compadres, with people who've got similar political views as we do. Most of us actually connect for many other reasons, personal and professional, with others. And in the process, we actually do see quite a broad range of political views, of ideologies show up in our social networks, online as much as offline, actually, as well, by the way. So this idea that the algorithms of social media platforms would pick up particularly on our political views, doesn't really make sense if people aren't really there on these platforms just for political reasons. So having said all of that, yes, it is possible to create really hard and exclusive echo chambers or filter bubbles around you, of course, but it is very rare. You'd really have to go to very much cult-like levels of ideological purity. You'd have to really disconnect actively from anyone who's got different views from you. And yeah, people might do that from time to time. They might not want all the MAGA Trump fans in their network, but it is ultimately very difficult to do this, to do it consistently. You'd have to invest a lot of energy. Where you can do it more easily is on really specialty platforms that cater to those very overtly ideological hyperpartisan groups. And that's really niche platforms like 4chan or 8chan or Gab or Parler. In future, I might be able to exclude X in this as well, of course, seeing that everyone else is leaving very actively at the moment. But even then, the people who are on these kinds of platforms are also demonstrably very, very active users of mainstream news. They're not actually disconnected by being on these platforms from the rest of the world. They're very actively following mainstream news. There's plenty of information, plenty of data on that as well. Because they of course need to incorporate what happens in the world into their own conspiracy theories, their own disinformation campaigns and so on. So they can't afford to be disconnected from mainstream news if they want to maintain their own ideological thrusts. And I think this kind of exemplifies this. Probably don't look too closely at this image, but it is an image from one of the anti-COVID protests in Melbourne here in Australia. And if you look at this, all of the conspiracy theories are coming together. There's QAnon there, there's Epstein there, there's the Clinton emails, the Great Awakening, geoengineering, Illuminati, adrenochrome, the list goes on. This is not someone who's disconnected and who's kind of just put themselves into an echo chamber or a filter bubble. This is someone who is very well and perhaps overexposed to what is available on the internet, has done, as they say, their own research, has found all of the information that's out there, has been, unable to really effectively process it, and has just put it all together into a great mishmash of conspiracy theories. So the problem is not that this person is, and others like her are disconnected from the rest of the network. The problem is, in fact, that they're too connected, that they are overwhelmed by information and maybe don't have the digital literacies to sift through this and work out what of this is actually reliable and believable, and instead have kind of created their own worldviews from a mishmash of everything that's out there. So it's actually the very opposite of being in echo chambers and filter bubbles. It's hyperconnectivity that here is the problem, if it is a problem. I do want to make clear this is not really an argument against connection online, because, of course, social connection via social media or offline also provides a lot of support for individuals and communities. So it's how you use and what skills you have to use this ability to connect with others that is fundamentally important. And so again, particularly the hyperpartisans are very well connected with the mainstream. This is a study from 2011 that showed already that people who were using Stormfront, the American fascist discussion board, were twice as likely to also visit the New York Times as were the visitors to a middle-of-the-road news site like Yahoo News. So the fascists, quite literally, are very active readers of a liberal newspaper like the New York Times, not because they believe in what the New York Times is writing about, what it's saying, but because they need to be aware of what their enemies are talking about. And the same is true in many other cases as well. One of the big targets for links out from Breitbart is the New York Times as well. Breitbart's not linking to that to say, hey, look, the New York Times has written some really good good stories, has some really good journalism. Breitbart is linking out to these sources in order to say, look what the liberals are writing. Here's what you need to hate today. Here's what you need to read critically today, because you need to be informed what the other side's thinking. So this is a form of hate reading, essentially. But they're, through that, of course, still very much aware of what the other side's saying and thinking. So it's connectivity, not disconnection, that actually is, if anything, the problem, or the thing that we should be paying attention to. Anything else, the idea of echo chambers, filter bubbles, ultimately is a very techno-determinist idea. What it really ignores is that people are diverse, they're complex, they're inconsistent, they have many interests, not just politics. In fact, most people couldn't care less about politics. And of course, an algorithm has genuine trouble sifting through all of these different interests and then shaping what it serves you. So most people have a thoroughly mixed information diet because of what they themselves select, but also what shows up serendipitously in their networks, just more randomly. So the problem in a sense, or the factor that undermines echo chambers and filter bubbles is that humans don't just have the single interest that these kinds of arguments suggest. And in fact, of course, the arguments are, again, as I said, very much based on just personal and anecdotal evidence, not necessarily on genuine empirical research. And of course, even since the 1990s, since Negroponte wrote about the Daily Me, the idea that algorithms and AI could just shape our information diet to a point where we no longer see what other people are thinking, just hasn't come to pass. We're still seeing a lot of stuff that we probably would not want to see normally. So even 20 years ago, again, David Weinberger wrote that the idea of the echo chamber is a myth. That's just waiting to concretize into common wisdom. And of course, in the meantime, it has very much been established and is now circulating without anyone, well, with few of us really questioning whether there's any truth to it. And of course, it's also been very much used quite cynically to shift blame, to attack social media platforms, to try and introduce policy that addresses them. Now, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of reasons for dealing with social media platforms. There's plenty of things that they do wrong. There's plenty of blame that we can heap on social media platforms. But actually, echo chambers and filter bubbles are the least of the problems here. So I really like this article from a German journalist who wrote that the filter bubble is the dumbest metaphor on the internet. Maybe not the dumbest, but it's not far from it. And it really has distracted us for years now from addressing far more significant problems. It's not that people don't encounter a lot of diverse content. It's not that people don't actually see a lot of stuff. The question always is what they do with it, how they process it, what capacity they have to process it. So this is sort of, the AI kind of interpretation of an echo chamber. And I think that really captures the way that many people who write about this end up seeing it, that you're kind of locked into this space. You've just got the one channel of information coming to you, and you're just receiving it in a very passive kind of way. I think the reality looks a lot more like this, where we're just overwhelmed with all of the information that's out there. It's very difficult to make sense of an increasingly complex world. And that's what really is pushing people into conspiracy beliefs and disinformation exposure, because it's just so hard to work out what's right or what's wrong anymore. So again, as Weinberger said 20 years ago, the problem with an extraterrestrial conspiracy mailing list isn't that it's an echo chamber, it's that it thinks there is a conspiracy by extraterrestrials. And the same really applies today now. The problem isn't that there are hyperpartisan echo chambers or filter bubbles, it's that there are these fringe groups that fundamentally reject and actively fight any mainstream societal and democratic consensus. So the problem ultimately is polarization, not fragmentation, is the fact that our political differences have been so far entrenched, and in fact it goes beyond politics and ideology, it goes to identity, that even though we still communicate with each other, we're increasingly just shouting at each other and no longer seeking consensus. That to me is a much more important problem that we need to urgently address. So it's not that there is an echo chamber, a filter bubble, that people are kind of just locked away in all of this. The filter is very much in people's heads instead. And and there is a QR code if you're interested in seeing more of this. Part of what my team and I are working on at the moment is really to sift through this idea of polarization and not just say polarization is inherently bad. That's not the case either. All politics is actually polarized to some extent. We wouldn't have different political parties without polarization, of course. And, depending on your views, that may or may not be a good thing, but we wouldn't even have different political opinions if we weren't at least to some extent polarized and had different opinions. Of course, most politics, I would say, is multipolar, not just left versus right. Unfortunately, a lot of the polarization literature comes out of the US, where they have a very impoverished party system, of course, and only really have those two big sides, both of which are kind of right-wing in many ways, just one much more so than the other. And the question for us is, actually, when does antagonism that can still be productive and can really bring out the differences in political views, when does that turn into destructive polarization? And we suggest in this work that there are 5 key symptoms for this. One is a breakdown of communication. That doesn't mean the absence of communication, but just that the different sides are no longer actively communicating and constructively communicating with each other. They might still be shouting at each other. A discrediting and dismissing of information, where you no longer believe in what the other side's saying. You're actually actively saying, no, this is untrue. An erasure of complexities, where everything just gets reduced to slogans like "Make America Great Again." Exacerbated attention and space for extreme voices, so the shifting of the Overton window to allow more and more extreme perspectives into public debate. And exclusion through emotions, so where everything becomes driven by emotions rather than rational debate. And I think we've seen quite a bit of that in the US, I know in recent Brazilian politics as well. So these 5, we think, are key symptoms of this kind of destructive polarization that we need to identify and then try and push back against as well. And that's really the question, of course. If we identify these symptoms, what can we do about them? How can we depolarize? How can we come back? Can we come back, in fact, perhaps, to a more constructive debate that's really seeking to address problems rather than just to outdo the other side and argue against the other side and try and remove them from power again? So these are the kind of the key questions for us that we need to address, I think, in future. And I'd really encourage all of you perhaps to think about how we might address them as well. But on that question, I will leave it, and hopefully we've got a little bit of time for discussion. Again, I'll just say, a lot of this is explained in more detail in this book, and not that it helps you much as Portuguese speakers, but there is now an Italian translation of it as well. So if you're interested in that, that's available as well. So thank you very much, and hopefully we've got a little bit of time for questions still as well.
So thank you, Professor Bruns. It was a very interesting presentation. We have the chat open for anyone who wants to put questions. In the meantime, let me make you one quick question. I think in your presentation, you presented like a hard version of the filter bubble echo chamber in which people are locked and not exposed to different worldviews, ideologies, and content. However, there is a much lighter version of echo chambers and filter bubbles in which people are mostly pushed either by algorithms or by chasing the content to content that looks like their worldviews, their ideology, and that reinforcement over time will be intensifying political polarization. So do you think in a lighter version, the filter bubble echo chamber hypothesis stands?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for this. And in many ways, look, yes, I agree that these patterns are there. That there is that kind of self-reinforcement possibly, or that, of course, again, selective exposure, to some extent selective avoidance, homophily and heterophobia, as I've said, these tendencies can exist and can certainly occur. Where I think it gets really problematic is if we kind of reinterpret the idea of echo chambers and filter bubbles, which has been defined in many ways in this very hard kind of way. I mean, we see Sunstein and Pariser and everyone who's followed on write about how damaging these processes are for society, how much people are kind of locked away into these kind of information cocoons, no longer see what's going on. So in some ways, we can't have it both ways. We can't say, okay, there is a milder version which doesn't really live up to the really significant consequences that Pariser and Sunstein and others are writing about, but then still call it echo chambers and filter bubbles. I think we end up just weakening those concepts, or weakening the definition of those concepts to such a point where they become meaningless. You know, we can at that point. I mean, you've mentioned the term polarization, for instance, which I think is a much more useful term in that case. I've used terms like communities of interest, ideological communities, whatever. You know, there's plenty of other terms that we have. You know, again, homophily, selective exposure, that describe in much clearer ways the processes and patterns that we actually see in those kinds of cases. What I really have a problem with is you know, terms like mild echo chambers, or that idea of both open forums and echo chambers, because in the way that, you know, if you look at the original kind of writing about these terms, in the way that they're defined, you really can't have it both ways. People can't be both locked away and not locked away from people who've got other views than themselves. So I think we're doing ourselves and our scholarship a disservice if we keep hanging on to these terms just because they're popular, but if we're using them in such a way that they no longer really make sense in the way that they've been defined. In a similar sort of way to the way we should be quite careful when we use terms like community, for instance, or publics, or whatever, you know, where we actually really need to think about, well, what do we mean by community here? Are these people genuinely connected, or are they all just an audience for a populist leader, for instance? You know, so I think we've got to be a lot sharper in the language that we're using. And yeah, I think because echo chambers and filter bubbles have become such floating signifiers, ultimately, it's very hard to do really good scholarship with them anymore. They're just so ill-defined, and we have much better defined terms that we should be using instead.
Thank you. Let me see if we got some questions. We have one question. Just let me get it and translate it. It says, which strategies do you think can be more effective to mitigate informational fragmentation?
Yep. That's a very good question, and I don't necessarily have an easy kind of ready-made answer, because of course this is a really wicked problem. I'll start by saying there are actually some good reasons to be fragmented in this way as well, because it reduces some of the daily friction and the daily exposure to sometimes very hateful and problematic content, of course. I mean, we see, and I know this has happened in Brazil even earlier than it is now happening in the US. We've seen that massive exodus, for instance, from Twitter, from X, to platforms like Blue Sky, just over the last few weeks. And I think that's in some ways almost a self-care kind of process, where people are saying, oh, I no longer want to be on X, where there's so many fascists and so much disinformation and so many hateful bots and everything else circulating. So I'm removing myself from that. I'm actually going to a platform that hopefully is better run and free of outright fascists. So in some ways, there are good reasons to make that kind of move and distance yourself from the really hateful content. But yes, it can create then, of course, a further communicative distance between us, and we still need to be aware in many ways as a society, if not always individually, of what these hateful actors are doing, both in our own countries and globally. My sense would be to find I guess at a personal level, find the level of counter-attitudinal information that you are comfortable with, and expose yourself to that. So yes, if you define yourself as progressive, then do read some conservative newspapers or news sources more generally. Follow what's going on there. You know that the other side's doing that, of course, in the other way as well. So be aware of what's going on in the world, certainly, but also it doesn't mean that you have to follow, every last hateful account or whatever in order to do that. So find the level of cross attitudinal exposure that you're comfortable with. I think it's also really important, and we've seen studies on depolarization, of course, that show that just going up to, say, a conspiracy community and kind of trying to debunk the information that's circulating amongst them often backfires, because it will just tell them that, yes, the other side's after them, people are trying to suppress them or whatever. So it may just reinforce their beliefs. So very often just directly engaging with others and saying, you're wrong, here's the truth, is not going to make the situation better. It might just entrench polarization on both sides. One of the things that quite a few people have pointed out is that there are still many things that connect us as well. It might not be politics, but it might be other interests. It might be football. It might be cultural interests and so on. So maybe that's a way in which we can connect with others who've got very different views to our own and gradually build that sort of trust again, where we can also start to talk about, disinformation, political ideology, whatever else. But that's a long-term project, and that's not something that can happen overnight. You cannot, you cannot depolarize politics overnight by just saying to everyone else, you're wrong, and here's the truth. That will not work. So we've got to find ways to really very gradually build up that kind of societal connection again. And at the moment, I don't think there's enough kind of projects that try to do that. It is just a lot of hard work for, in the first place, very little gain. It will take long-term political will, societal will to actually do that, and not just say these people are deplorables, these people are beyond good and evil, they cannot be brought back from the brink. For some people that may well be true, but I think if we kind of just give up on half the population by saying that, then that can't be a solution.
Of course. So thank you so much, Professor, for finding some time in a very early period in Australia. Thank you for being here with us. We know you have another commitment soon afterwards. Thank you for being here, and hope to see you soon when you come to Brazil.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really sorry I couldn't make it in person this time, but yes, hopefully next year, certainly around the AIR conference, I'll be there and be able to visit Brazil again. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope this was useful.
Thank you. Good morning.
Goodbye. See you.